Okay, welcome back. This is the third video of the Gull Guides featured highlight series, March 2025. Last time in video 2, we discussed the pre-alternate molt that's found in first cycle large gulls. We looked at things like the yellow-footed gull, kelp gull, and we explained those molts are by and large partial molts in that they don't include the flight feathers, or we don't expect the flight feathers to be replaced in these pre-alternate molts and gulls. What I want to do in this video is talk about some of the molts that are found in our first cycle small gulls. Things like Bonapartes, Sabines, and how these differ from the large white-headed gulls. And so all birds can be thought of as having one of four fundamental molt strategies. And with our gulls, they by and large are going to be either simple alternate or complex alternate. And the only exception to this is ivory gull, which is kind of a weird case. It goes from juvenile plumage directly into its adult plumage. So there are no inserted partial molts. It doesn't have a pre-alternate molt, or at least it's believed not to. So once again, pre-basic molts drive a molt cycle. There are these comprehensive events that a molt cycle begins with. They include all the body and flight feathers, and we believe all birds have this pre-basic molt as a commonality. Understanding these four molt strategies usually involves understanding what's happening in the complex alternate strategy. If we can wrap our heads around CAS, then the other ones kind of fall into place because we could just subtract from the complex alternate strategy and understand what's happening in the others. So to begin here, the complex alternate strategy has birds that see two partial molts in their first cycle. And so the first one is attributed to preformative molt, and the second one is the first pre-alternate molt. And a really good example of a gull, a small gull, that undergoes this strategy is Bonaparte's. So on page 22, I have this plate 35, plate 36, plate 37. Kind of walks you through what's happening with a Bonaparte's gull and why this is referred to as the complex alternate molt strategy. So you have this individual in August, largely juvenile. We can call this thing first basic or juvenile, same thing. It has this cinnamon wash on the neck, on the head. The scapulars are this brownish cinnamon color. And shortly after fledging, a lot of them will start to replace scapulars, just as we find in some ringbills and herrings that have first pre-alternate molts. But this molt is not attributed to first pre-alternate. It's attributed to something called preformative molt. Preformative molts only occur in the first molt cycle. And in gulls, for the most part, they're partial. So we're going to have head feathers, as we see here. This guy now has a whitish head, grayish neck. All the scapulars appear to be replaced. And the result here is formative plumage. What's interesting, though, is several months later, as we get closer to the breeding season, right around this time of year, late February, March, into April, these Bonapartes in first cycle undergo another molt known as the first pre-alternate molt. So what's happening here is the head feathers are being replaced a second time in first cycle. The neck feathers go from gray to white. Compare that to this individual here. They often have a lot of gray wash in formative. And then in first alternate, they become a lot brighter. And if we look at their scapulars, you can very often notice some fresh edges here. They're not worn and frayed as they were back in, say, December, January. These birds now, a lot of them will replace scapulars for a second time. And the result is first alternate plumage. And that's really how we want to understand the complex alternate strategy. This complex alternate strategy has these two inserted molts in the first cycle. If we look at this figure 1 on page 21, we can see the preformative molt results in formative plumage. First pre-alternate molt results in first alternate plumage. And that about concludes the first molt cycle. So when does the second molt cycle begin? The second molt cycle begins when the second pre-basic molt begins, meaning when we start to see flight feather molt in something like Bonaparte's. You notice this molt gap here and this molt gap here. This bird is now molting primaries, and it is safe to say the second pre-basic molt has begun. And so this bird is a second cycle, meaning it's in its second molt cycle now. And this is a comprehensive molt. It's going to see some molt in every feather track: secondaries, coverts, tail feathers, head feathers. And it'll continue on until about September, October with these second cycles. So here we again still have active second pre-basic molt. And when that molt concludes, we have a plumage known as the second basic plumage. Now I'm just using this individual here in December for demonstration purposes. There are some second basic birds that are much more obvious than this. They have streaking on the coverts, on the tail feathers, maybe some black centers to their secondaries. And then several months later, these birds at the onset of the breeding season will be in second alternate plumage. And that second alternate plumage is a result of the second pre-alternate molt. Let's go back up to figure 1. Second pre-basic molt results in second basic plumage. Second pre-alternate molt results in second alternate plumage. And so by second basic, second alternate, we really have no way of knowing if this Bonaparte's is 2 years old or 15 years old. They all more or less reach stases, and they will continue to alternate from one basic plumage to an alternate plumage and so on and so forth. Again, the key takeaway here for complex alternate strategy, there's a partial preformative molt and partial first pre-alternate molt. With our large gulls that undergo this simple alternate strategy, we believe they only have an inserted pre-alternate molt. So there isn't this preformative molt in these large gulls, as well as the kittiwakes. Kittiwakes, interestingly, have SAS molt strategy. One more example of a bird that undergoes this complete alternate strategy, Sabine's gull. Very unique case in that it is our longest migrating gull. And it does a lot of what we find in some of the terns and Jaegers. Sabine's gull abides by complex alternate strategy, but it's believed that Sabine's has a complete preformative molt. So I'm going to show you some slides here that detail that. When we see them in August, September, even in October, many of them look scaly, brownish gray with pale fringing on the scapulars and coverts. But those advanced birds, or birds that linger, say, through November, December, like this individual from Texas, we can start to see some of their formative scapulars and formative coverts and head feathers. But as they get down to the non-breeding grounds and they start to settle in, remember some of these Sabines go to South Africa, Namibia, off the Atlantic, and then some of these Sabines end up in places like Peru and Chile off of the Humboldt Current in the Pacific. But what they do is, in first cycle, they start to replace flight feathers, as we can see in this molt gap. Tail feathers, the head feathers are white. So all of this is believed to be via an extensive to complete preformative molt. And so here's an individual in Chile in April now, well into the non-breeding season for them. This bird has replaced many primaries, most of its tail feathers, wing coverts, secondaries, and what's probably happening at this point in April, it's probably replacing scapulars for a second time via a first pre-alternate molt. Right, because Sabines does abide by complex alternate strategy where it has a preformative and first pre-alternate molt. But the interesting thing about this species is that it replaces flight feathers in the preformative molt. So here's this bird perched, same individual from Chile in April. We see by and large a formative plumage. If you look closely, it's not too hard to see some of these residual juvenile coverts, but also these frayed outer primaries, these brown washed out primaries are also first basic or juvenile. At this time of year, they just tend to have more dark on the hind collar than adults. But most interesting is when they head north for their first northbound migration. So this bird can be classified as either formative or first alternate. The first alternates usually have cleaner white heads. They don't show that much black on the nape. But it's clearly not an adult bird. This bird is only about a year old. And some of the distinguishing features are they're going to show washed out coverts. They don't have this black luster to their primaries. They're more brownish, washed out color. The bill pattern is sometimes used to age some of these formative birds, but even adult Sabines in August, September can start to show a dull bill pattern, but that in July I think is helpful in aging this bird. But the hind collar as well. It doesn't look like a bird that is attempting to be an alternate adult. So we can hold this individual back and call it first alternate. And, for splitting hairs and looking really close, because if there are two molts in this complex alternate strategy of Sabines gulls, then some of these wing coverts can be formative, and some of these newer, more bluish gray ones can be first alternate. And that's the whole idea with this two inserted molts complex alternate strategy, is that these same follicles saw feather growth twice in the same molt cycle. So that's one thing you'd want to keep in mind for complex alternate strategy. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. That's the difference here between our large gulls and small gulls, is this additional inserted molt in first cycle known as preformative. Next time, we're going to talk about the second molt cycle and pick it up with the start of the second pre-basic molt and start to get into second and third cycle. Hopefully by video 5, we will have concluded most of our discussion on molt and plumages. And I think that's a really important way to start our highlights in this series, is getting a foundation in plumage and associating a plumage with the molt that produced it. And it's often, gull watchers who appreciate these things have a sense for why a bird has the look that it does at a certain time of year, and why the patterns that are emerging on certain gulls may look different than conspecifics, say, at a different latitude, for example. So we'll get into that next time. Again, if you have any suggestions or requests for future videos, just send them to thegullguide@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.